welcome to the C.S. Joseph podcast, and today we're doing episode 5 of the critic's perspective, or how to deal with other people's critic. And today we'll be talking about Fi Critic, how to deal with the Fi Critic in other INFJs and other ISFJs. So one thing to note as we get to the second introverted critic is addressing kind of what I think is a misnomer amongst people who study the psychology, and that is that introverted functions, specifically introverted functions in the unconscious, still affect the external circumstance, okay? So, for example, Fi critics, yes, they are very critical of themselves, very critical of their worth, of their, of where they should invest, very critical of needing to always be consistent in order to get the acceptance of the critic, and even then, sometimes that's not enough. But Fi critics can also be extremely hard to please. It's not just them attacking themselves, right? They can be very dismissive of the worth of things in general. This is some way it can kind of look like Fi critic sometimes, but Fi critic, the sentence "that's not good enough" is something that's not just about themselves. It's about other people. It's about a gift, an experience, whatever it may be. That's not good enough, right? It can be better. It can be better. It can be better. This is one way that Fi critics can unintentionally beat down other people because they're not always, their self-criticism can push towards other things, towards other people, and can tear those things down, right? So the first question here, which we hinted at a little bit, is what is Fi critic like? So you know what you're dealing with when you're interacting with an Fi critic. Fi critic is sort of this lens that nothing is as good as it could be, and that they certainly are not as good as they should be. Fi critics lead with this assumption that for whatever reason, and reason's an important word here, for whatever reason that they are lacking, that they are unworthy, that they are undeserving of good things, right? Now, there's a trick here, I think, that can help all critic functions, both extroverted and introverted critics, in developing our own awareness of when our critic is attacking self or others. And that is simply asking the question, who gave you the authority to judge, right? For Fi critics, it can seem like an altruistic thing of the self-dismissiveness of, I'm not worthy, I'm not XYZ. But if you dig under that, there's usually a type of pride there, this sort of arrogance of self-neglect that sort of is how to say it other than a kind of a masochistic martyrdom turn-on almost for Fi critics and for the critics in general. That they, by Fi critics taking themselves out of the picture, that somehow that they're elevated into a certain standing. And that's just usually not true, but also, I think more importantly, there's an assumption that they actually are the ones who should make that judgment. And if the critics learn to tune, if the types and the INFJ and the ISFJ learn to tune in to that voice and that criticism that is assuming that it has the authority to judge their worth, then they can start to ask, why are you Fi critic? Why do you have the authority to determine how I should feel or how worthy or unworthy I am, right? And by asking that question, it breaks loose some of the illusion that drives us unconsciously towards, in some way, in some circumstances, this sort of self-hatred, right? So, one of the themes that's going to be moving through this series is the difference between an extroverted and introverted critic in terms of how we should approach these, right? So for extroverted critics, for a TE critic, for FE critic, for any critic, and SE critic, there's a difference here between corralling versus expanding, right? And extroverted critics are, by nature, already expanding, right? They're pushing out, they're kind of judging the things around them, sometimes a little bit, in a way that's out of control. And the introverted critics, likewise, but in the inverse way, are attacking the self with these fiery, kind of dynamic self-violence almost in some ways. So for the introverted critics, when you're dealing with an INFJ or an ISFJ, trying to encourage them to expand the Fi critic of, okay, what is, take themselves, it's sort of taking themselves out of the picture and making the standard of Fi critic, ask them, okay, is that a standard for everyone, right? Expand the scope of it, right? For extroverted critics, it's the opposite, right? They're already, kind of judging everyone else. So it's kind of putting the scope back towards themselves. And like, okay, for TE critics, have you done the research that you're criticizing everyone of not doing, right? Or would you be willing to, right? And the reason that this is important, this expansion and this corralling, is that it gets the other party involved. The blind spot of the critic is either being blind to other people, of FI critics judging themselves, but not being aware with FE parent of that, other people don't judge themselves that harshly, or I don't judge other people so harshly, or really more so that other people don't do well when they're judged as harshly as I'm judging myself, right? And for an extroverted critic, it's the opposite, right? Of holding yourself to the same standard that you hold everyone else, right? Especially for something like FE critic and TE critic. So say that you're dealing with an ISFJ coworker and they're just beating up about a mistake that they may have made, right? And something that you can do to interact with them in possibly a very positive way is encouraging them to expand their standard of expanding their self-critical nature to kind of this universal principle of, okay, are you the only one that's not allowed to make mistakes? Are you the only one who has to be perfect, right? And then it's like, and then TI child wakes up and is like, well, no, that can't be right? So encouraging the introverted critic to expand, taking it from their specific instance to a universal perspective, to a general perspective. That's one really effective way, as long as that person's willing to engage with you, right? That's one really effective way to get the critic, to help someone get out of their own way when it comes to their critic, right? And when you do that, when you're the one who's helping the FI critic relax a little bit, then the critic is less stuck up, right? And is maybe even more willing to invest in you, potentially, right? Or to show appreciation to you, because this orbit of FE parent and FI critic, here's the guidance circuit between the critic, child, trickster, and parent. This orbit here is when the critic is freed up, is able to relax a little bit, is able to play a little bit in the way that it wants to become like the child, right? Then it becomes more grateful towards the people that have helped it, right? And that is sort of one of the secrets of the critic function, is that the parent, which is supposed to be the most effective function in our mind, becomes so much more effective when the critic can relax and when the critic can be open, right? So for FI critics, giving them the opportunity to take themselves out of the picture, right? To give them a universal perspective of whatever self-judgment that they're going through. That's one way to wake up the child, which is really the other piece that we've been talking about in the first few lectures here. In order to really deal with someone's critic, you need to engage the opposite side of the reflection, right? And by giving TI child the input of, does your self-judgment just apply to you? Are you the only one not allowed to make mistakes? Then the TI child can latch onto that and be like, well, that can't be true. Therefore, my standard is wrong, okay? And this right here is probably the most important thing to understanding FI critics, how to interact with other FI critics, and even how to deal with your own FI critic. And that is asking the question, what is the standard? Because the other key for this series, certainly it's engaging the child, right? That's really, really important. But one way to engage the child very effectively is going through the trickster. Because the trickster and the trickster's ignorance and the trickster's blind spot is what enables the critic to stay in its paralysis, right? And its arrogant skepticism, as I mentioned, I think in the last video. The trickster, the reason that T trickster can be so damaging to Fi critics is because they're leading with the assumption that they're bad, and then they'll build up the rationale because they can, T tricksters can conjure rationale out of anywhere. That may not make any sense, but they can conjure it still. When you lead with the assumption that I'm not worthy, then of course you're going to start to rationalize that in whatever way that you can, right? So what you can do with dealing with other Fi critics is you need to provide input. Now, some of us are not TE users naturally, so that means we can learn to ask questions, right? And questions, the best question that I believe to ask an Fi critic is digging down and saying, what is the standard? Because this harsh self-criticism, that makes the Fi critics paralyzed, not being able to really invest in the things that they want to, having a really hard time showing gratitude, even having a hard time apologizing at times, which is maybe a surprising thing for some of you to hear. Digging down and just asking them, what is the standard? What is the standard? What is the standard that you're operating on? And eventually, what you'll probably find is some assumption. And that assumption is just, I'm not worthy, or I can't do it, XYZ, I'm not this, I'm not that, blah, 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 right? And when the root of it is revealed, T.I. Child's able to latch onto it and say, wow, that's the kind of the parasitic root that's causing all this self-loathing, basically. And then it's this sort of relaxing moment kicks in, because what TE tricksters really, really struggle with is when they don't feel like they can sense clarity. They want clarity, because T.I. Child their divine childlike powers can be unlocked once clarity is established. So you have the opportunity to be the one to provide that clarity by just asking the question, what is the standard that you're operating off of? Why are you so hard on yourself? What is the standard that you have that's making you so self-critical, right? And attached to these questions are a couple points of, for all the introverted critics, at least, I'm not sure about the extroverted critics, but at least for the introverted critics, you don't really want to target the critic directly, because, like we said in the INTJ, ISTJ, TI critic lecture, you don't just want to walk up to a TI critic and say, I think you're really smart. It's like, just going straight for it isn't really the best way. For a TI critic, for example, talking about how their brains or how their solutions led to utility, led to benefit, led to helping others, that's one way to target TI critic, right? Likewise, for FI critic, you speak to the critic in one way, at least, through the trickster, of saying, giving them reasons to show why the time that they did invest was actually really helpful, or why the time when they did show gratitude was a really good standard for them to operate by, right? It's supplying some input, because in the face of a good reason, T.I. Child would no longer be able to defend Fi critics' assumption that I'm terrible, XYZ, right? When you supply good input for something valuable that the Fi critic, that the INFJ, the ISFJ did, and some reasoning behind it, right? Maybe some concrete evidence, maybe some statistics. It can be a myriad of TE emulation. Then the TI Child's able to see, well, that is true. I did contribute something with my FE parent, right? Therefore, I can't be completely useless, right? And that little insight of I can't be completely useless, that is one crack in the door that leads you to be able to speak to someone's critic function, right? So attached to what is the standard, I think there's two sub-questions there as we finish up here to consider. And you can ask this, or it can be kind of a meditative practice. And that is, okay, what is the standard, right? But also, whose standard or whose expectation am I enforcing? Is it my own? Is it the voice of my parents? Is it the voice of a coach, someone, an ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend who broke up with me or who I broke up with, whatever it may be, right? A pastor, a counselor, especially people who have had some authority in your life. Those tend to be the people whose expectations are going to carry with you through time, even when you don't have a relationship with them any longer, right? So asking, whose expectation are you operating by? Whose expectation are you trying to meet? And sometimes it's just their own standard for trying to be perfect, right? Oh, I have to meet my own expectation. And again, you can ask them, like, why are you expecting that of yourself? Or if you really want to kind of go for it, of who gave you the authority to judge yourself, right? Something like that. So whose expectation and what expectation? These are the two things that offer a lot of clarity, that provide the input for TI child to just sort of suck up and absorb me, like, wow, I really am operating. I'm assuming that someone else has more authority over this than I do, or vice versa. I'm assuming that I'm the ultimate authority over my own worth, right? And neither of those are really the best way forward, right? So for Fi Critic, though, I think the end question to ask them, and this is kind of a test, I think, of someone's character too, is trying to figure out, where will you invest, but more so, are you too good or are you above investing at all? Because Fi Critics can have this perspective, especially because the INFJ and the ISFJ can be a little bit fatalistic with their any inferior and any nemesis. Are you above trying to make things better, right? Because they can kind of have this weird detachment at times, even though they feel very colorfully within themselves. They kind of appear cold to a lot of people. But even so, they can have this sort of a detachment of, well, I'm not gonna do anything because this is all crap and I can't do anything anyway. And the way to check to see if an INFJ and ISFJ is still, I think, on the path to developing their character is if they're still willing to contribute something, if they're still willing to invest, even if they don't feel like they're up to it, or even if they are dismissing the effort that someone else has put in. Checking to see, are you too good to act? Because again, we often say that the NFPs or the FI heroes and the FI parents are the most selfish of the types, and sometimes that is true. They can be extremely self-important, but FI critics sort of have this hidden self-importance too, of it's sort of the authority they give themselves because of the martyrdom that they impose upon themselves, right? So oftentimes it kind of makes them holier than thou in some ways. And Chase has talked about this several times, of one of the reasons FI critics can be alienating is because these super high standards that they that bleed through to their interactions with others and affect the people around them, right? So one practical way for FI critics to deal with that is to see how people feel when their FI critic bleeds out in unattended ways, right? Or even in intended ways. And people will kind of start to distance themselves, because it can be really hard to please Fi critic. It can be very hard to extract some sense of warmth or gratitude from them, because they have really high standards, right? But I think on a day-to-day level, in the same way that we talked about TI critic needing to be listened to, this is one of the other places that is really important, I think, to bring up in as many lectures as possible, and that the cognitive reflection functions, the battleground of responsibility here, the battleground of innocence here, each end of the reflection shares some surprising similar experience. And for the critic and the child, especially Fi critic and TI child, both of them experience not being heard, not being listened to. And we talked about in the INTJ, ISTJ lecture how elderly people are very easy to dismiss, right? Because they're old, they're senile, they don't know what they're talking about. They're very easy to dismiss. But they're the ones who tend to have the most wisdom. And if you take the time, sure, they'll probably recount stories that you've heard 10 times, maybe, right? But if you take the time to listen to them, to hear them, there is the opportunity for that wisdom to be unlocked, to be shared with you. And what FI critics, I think, are trying to communicate is that good things are rare. Quality things are rare. And if people just put in the time to invest more in the right areas, then this world would be a better place and then be less harm, right? Because FI critics' perspective, and the critic as a whole, their perspective is often justified. They have these rationales, and I'm not just talking about TE trickster rationales, but they have these reasons, they have these insights that are often accurate, right? But where to weigh them out, they may be misconstrued of, the world's only this way. But FI critics are really upset with the lack of quality, with the lack of integrity, with the overwhelming amount of people and the overwhelming trends that tend toward expediency, that tend towards, just trying to get yours. And I think what FI critics sees, perhaps better than anyone, than any type, is that if people cared about their own integrity, if they really put in the effort and the attentiveness to fill out what is actually good, what is actually worthy, and what is actually not worthy, right? Not all pursuits are created equal. Not all relationships are going to be valuable or good, right? And certainly, we should hold ourselves to a standard of integrity. That way, that we become the source of the change that we want to see in the world, right? Like that famous quote about being the change in the world that you want to see. So, giving FI critic the opportunity to speak to and to kind of take their insight seriously is the equivalent of being with your grandparent, even when they're a little senile, even when they're repeating those same stories, right? There's still wisdom there, and inviting them more to keep sharing and to challenge, right? Because they can handle the challenge and they're looking for the challenge. The child is really looking for the challenge. The critic is almost wants to be self-assured that its assumptions are right. But when provided with enough input, provided with enough challenge, it will tend to shake them out of apathy, and they'll be like, well, I can't just sit here any longer, or they'll double down in their own kind of self-narrative that they've taught themselves, that they've said to themselves. And at that point, maybe that interaction is no longer going to be valuable. But something to consider. I gave you guys hopefully a lot of practical tools here. There's more kind of, I think, rules in this one than I've talked about in the other ones. And I think I can relate to the complexity of FI critic because it's not as simple as it seems. It's not just a self-loathing, right? This sort of self-condemnation, even though it often is that too. It extends to other things, right? So giving the INFJs and the ISFJs space to share what they're critical about and why, you'll start to understand, wow, like they actually have some good reasons why, right? And maybe that makes sense why you're kind of negative a lot of the time. But by inviting that, right? And by challenging the child and challenging the critic, especially through providing input, that critic can start to experience that path to being childlike again, right? And the proof of this integration of the critic is when the critic becomes a little more innocent, becomes a little bit more playful, rather, because this battleground is about innocence. Playfulness is really the critic's test to see if movement, if they can move. Because if a critic is stale, they're just going to rot and they're going to become more critical. The test of life, especially in old age, especially with our critic, is if you're still going to get up, if you're still going to contribute, if you're still going to invest in things worthwhile, right? And the FI critic has to decide whether or not they're going to make basically the good the enemy of the perfect, right? I love that quote, and that's so important for FI critics of, maybe things aren't perfect, but by accepting what is good and investing in the thing that has the potential for being really good, that's sort of the way that FI critic gets off its own high horse and says, okay, this isn't perfect, but this is still helpful, this is still useful, and I'm going to choose to invest here, right? So anyway, folks, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think down below with your questions, insights, experiences, and anecdotes. I like hearing what you guys have to say. And we'll see you in the next episode where we will start talking about the perception functions for the critic. So we'll see you guys then. Bye.